Good evening and welcome to the Italian Impact Podcast. I am your host, Steve Stefano Mancini, and as always, I would like to thank you, the listener, for tuning in. And as always, I want to thank the international listeners. You know, we record this out of Robert Morris University here in Pittsburgh, but it is a global podcast, so I thank everyone from Australia to the UK to Italy, Canada, Singapore, China, Russia, and even countries in Africa, and even a lot of listeners down in Brazil. So truly, I could say this is a global podcast. So thank you very much. Grazie mille per ai miei ascoltatori. And, I'm hoping I'll have a good show for you today. And with that being said, I also want to mention, and I would be remiss if I didn't do this, is to encourage you, if you have not seen it yet, the documentary Fedeltà, Soldier Prisoner. It is the story of the 1,250 Italian prisoners of war that were kept at Letterkenny Army Depot at Chambersburg, PA. And if you are in Pennsylvania or New York or New Jersey, Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio, I would encourage you to go make the trip over to Chambersburg and check out the chapel. The chapel that the prisoners built is still there, as well as the former base commander's house. So the original base commander back during the war, his house is still there, and it's kind of a nice little museum, so you can go check that out. But if you're interested in learning more, hit me up at questions@ItalianImpactWeekly.com. But I encourage you to get out there at Amazon Prime. You can catch Fedeltà, Soldier Prisoner. It is available, and, I want you to watch it soon, because this year marks the 80th anniversary of the construction of the chapel. So I would like it for you to have seen the documentary. And then if you can make time, in September, there's going to be about 30 family members of the prisoners making a return trip to Chambersburg to go have some services and different events. So it's going to be a really nice time, to mark the 80th anniversary. So again, please check out the documentary, Fedeltà, Soldier Prisoner, and then mark your calendar for September of this year to make a trip out to Chambersburg, PA, to visit the chapel, meet the families of the prisoners, et cetera, et cetera. All right. With that being said, I would like to introduce my guest, this is an example of one of those requests that I get from people that are listening and say, hey, you should interview so-and-so. And of course, I always go, who is this? And they tell me, it's your cousin. I say, oh, okay. In that case, I'm going to listen to you. But I digress. But I have a request for this guest, and I'm actually excited because I've listened to other interviews from him, and he's got a lot to talk about, and we're going to try and do it because today is a special show because I'm going to have two guests on. I'm kind of booked coming up the next few weeks with a lot of guests, and I'm really grateful and excited for that. So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Sam Bozzolla. Sam, how are you?
Okay, thank you, Steve. How are you?
I'm living the dream, my friend. I'm living the dream. Look what I get to do.
Thank you for having me on. I've been in this country since 1974. I came over from Bologna, Italy, where I was born and raised there, and then I came with my parents and my brother, and have been here ever since.
All right. Well, that kind of answers on a joking note, I usually say, so tell me about your Italian heritage. Well, yours is pretty direct. I'm going to make a leap of faith that you still got a lot of family back there.
A little bit, not much. Both my parents are gone. My father's brothers are also passed, and I have a couple cousins and a niece, but not many anymore. Because the families were already old when I was put into this world. So they were I don't have as many as I would like, unfortunately.
Now, do you make it back there at all?
Yeah, I went back after we moved here in '74. We stayed here for about 6 years without going back. In 1980, we went back, and then I went back every year up to 2016. And then, unfortunately, that's the year that my mother passed, and then shortly thereafter, my father passed. And I have a brother who's in a wheelchair, so I'm his caretaker or caregiver, I should say. And so I haven't been back since then, and I really miss going. I'm trying to go either later this year if I can, or if not, maybe next year. But I do miss going, and I also, to tell you the truth, I miss speaking Italian because now with my parents gone, I have a few friends, but otherwise I don't have that much of a chance to speak Italian, even though I do teach it. So, yeah. So
I was going to say, it's funny you say that because, I've been studying Italian for years, and that was the biggest challenge. Non riesco a parlare italiano qui negli Stati Uniti, ovviamente perché parliamo inglese, so è difficile per me. So.
Esattamente, sì.
So,
Parlare, sì.
so I tell people, they say, well, how long have you been studying Italian? I say, well, not really that long because I can't really practice it, so it's difficult.
Yeah, my Italian teaching has, I always said, it's four-pronged approach. You have to learn vocabulary, of course. You have to learn pronunciation. You have to learn some grammar. But the one point that most, I think, teachers don't really work on, don't really think about, is comprehension.
Right.
I've met so many people who speak well, go to Italy, and they come back and they say, you know what, I was speaking and people would answer me and I just didn't know what they were saying. So
Yes.
learning the language that way is kind of I don't want to say a waste, but it limits you very much on what you can, how you can converse when you're in country. So I'm a big proponent of telling people you have to listen to the language, and especially an Italian language where it has so many dialects and so many different inflections, so many different things, that it's very sometimes almost difficult when you're there, because if you're in Bologna, where I'm from, we say Venezia for Venice. Well, you go to Venezia, they don't call it Venezia, they say Venetia. I Venetiani parlano tutti così. They have such a strange inflection in their speaking that it's kind of difficult as you move from region to region, or even sometimes city to city. So that is a challenge for people that go over there. But of course, in 2025, I would think that unless you go to some smaller cities, mostly I would say 80% of the Italians speak English. So that's always your escape route. If you can't do it, just start talking English, and most people will understand you.
Well, it's funny. It's kind of 2 points. It's funny you say that. Was when I went there, I sort of ran into that. It's the comprehension, because I can't immerse myself here. And then the only thing is, so I get it why you'd want to speak English. If you say, well, I don't understand it as well. My fear was I'm not going to learn it unless I do it. And so when I'm there, even when there's times I'm just going, yes, or I'm just going, see, but I really don't understand half what they're saying. But I'm like, what do I do? You're almost embarrassed on one hand, but that's a tough balancing act, because I want to learn it.
It is a tough balancing act, and a lot of people, it's interesting. I've been teaching the language probably about almost 30 years now. And I do it both privately, and I also do it through different organizations and schools. And I find that a lot of people want to learn a language, but they don't, sometimes don't want to put the time in, and B, they get frustrated if after 3 or 4 months they don't understand the language. And so I tell them, it's the same kind of thing as if you're learning to play piano. You're not going to be able to play a Mozart piano concerto after 3 months you've been studying the piano, unless you are a prodigy. You're like a baby Mozart. And people don't get that. People think, language is not, there are polyglots out there. There are people that understand, that learn, pick up things, sure. But the older you get, and after about 14, 15 years old, it becomes a little more difficult. I was fortunate enough when I came to this country, even though I didn't speak a word of English, I was still young enough that I was able to learn the language fairly well. And so but my father, who, when he came, he was already in his 30s, all the way till he passed, he always spoke with a fairly heavy accent, because he just, when you get to a certain point, your brain just doesn't get rid of that accent. So, and things like that. So yeah, learning a language, it's difficult, it's tedious. Sometimes it can be boring, and sometimes it can be frustrating, but you have to really keep after it. And today, with all these platforms you have out there, you have Amazon Prime, you have Netflix, and all those things, it's easy to go on and listen to people speak Italian. And what I tell people, if you're going to look at a movie on Netflix or Amazon or YouTube, don't put the English subtitles, because your brain is going to go right to those subtitles, and you'll never hear anyone speak. You'll just listen to or look at the subtitles, and that defeats the purpose of listening to the language.
No, that's absolutely right. Now what advice do you give, say, for old, like I'm an older learner. You see, I grew up hearing Italian, but I never consciously tried to learn it. I had
Well,
neighbors who spoke it, so it's there, but you're not trying to learn it. And now later in life, I said, well, I want to learn it now. So I think there's an advantage of having heard the sounds at a young age. But,
yeah, Italian, Italian it's a fairly straightforward language as far as pronunciation, much easier than English, much easier than German, much easier than French, but it's every vowel, every consonant is pronounced, unlike French, where, a lot of the final consonants are silent, So in Italian, that you don't have that. Everything is as is, and every sound never fluctuates. It's always going to be the same sound. So in that sense, the pronunciation of the language is much easier than most languages that I've encountered. Now, of course, if you get away from the macro and you get into the micro of the language, the grammar is difficult. We have 14 tenses, 7 simple, 7 with, the auxiliary verbs, and you have prepositions. And so that can be a challenge for someone who doesn't, know that. Plus, the Italian, like French, is a Romance language. English isn't a Romance language, so you have, it's a bit different. I would have to say. So, but again, it's the same thing. Italian. What's the easiest What's the easiest opera to sing? Italian, because everything is on the vowel and it's easy.
Well, great segue. Let's talk opera. You did it. I don't know if you did that on purpose or by accident. If you wanted to hurry up and get to the conversation, let's do it.
Sure. So I have to tell you that I saw my first opera when I was, I think, 6 years old in Italy, and the reason for that is I come from a very long line of opera singers, artists. And my grandfather sang at the Metropolitan Opera for 25 years, and then after that he went on to Broadway, and then he went to Hollywood. His name was Ezio Pinza, and then in this country he's known for the famous song "Some Enchanted Evening" from South Pacific.
Oh, I do know that song.
Yeah, so he was, he really, his career was opera. He was Don Giovanni, he was Figaro, he was Faust, the Devil, but he retired from the Met, as I said, after 25 years in 46, actually 47, and he and my mother were at the hotel in New York where they lived at the time. And one afternoon, my mother tells the story. There was a knock on the door, and my mother went to answer, and it was 2 distinguished gentlemen with suits and a hat on, and they said, "We would like to talk to Mr. Pinza." And my mother said, "Do you have an appointment?" And they said, "No, we kind of just thought we could try to get in and talk to him." And she said, "Okay, let me see if he's available. May I ask who's calling?" And they said, "Rogers and Hammerstein."
We've heard of them too.
They came in and they said, "Mr. Pinza, we're here because we want to propose an idea to you that we have this Broadway play in mind, and we have you in mind as the lead alongside Mary Martin." So my grandfather, back then, things were a little different in the world. He said, "Well, I'm an opera singer. I'm not really a Broadway singer. I'm not sure that I can make that transition with the voice." And they said, "Oh, we understand, but here's the music. We'll leave it with you. You think about it and let us know." Well, then he looked at it, and one thing led to another, and he did it. He agreed to do it, and he only did it for a year, but he won the Tony Award for Best Actor in a Musical on Broadway, and I think it was 49 or 48 that happened. So, and then after that, he went to Hollywood, made some movies with Janet Leigh was one of them.
Oh, okay.
And you can see one of the movies. I think it's on Amazon. It's called Mr. Imperium. I believe that's on Amazon. You can see it.
That actually sounds familiar.
Yeah. So then my mother was also started singing, and she had a fairly decent career until she went to Italy in '55, where she met my father. And strangely enough, she stopped singing. She stopped doing anything there was to do with opera, nothing at all. And from 1955 to 1974, there was nothing in her life regarding opera. And unfortunately, I never asked her why. I always wanted to, and I never got around to it, and never really got the chance to ask her why, what happened. So then she came here. We came here in the States because of my brother having cerebral palsy, they suggested we come to Pittsburgh specifically for Children's Hospital to see if there was things they could do. And my mother started working. This is another funny story, up here at a drugstore / soda fountain place where they would be. Back in the 70s, they had those where you could go in and go to the pharmacy on the left, and on the right side was a counter where you could have burgers, hamburgers, sodas. So she had been working there for about a year, and a gentleman came in, and he ordered something, and then he looked at her and he said, "Somebody told me that you're Ethiopin's daughter." And my mother said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "What are you doing making burgers in Bellevue?" And she explained the story. So he said to her, "Have you ever thought of teaching opera?" My mother said, "No." She said, "I never did." He went on to say, "There's a position open that I know at Duquesne University. They're looking for a professor of voice. You might be interested. We'll see, maybe." So my mother went. They hired her. And in all honesty, she became a better voice teacher than she was ever a singer. And she had an illustrious career as a voice teacher. She had so many students that came out and became professionals. There's some from Pittsburgh. There's a gentleman here in the North Hills. His name is Kevin Glapp. He made a great career. There's one of the hosts on WQED radio, Anna Singer. She studied with my mother. And so, and then she founded a school in Italy in honor of her father, and she took American-born students over there for 6 weeks, and that went on for 30 years. I've always been immersed in opera, and I was fortunate enough, through my mother, to meet and have a very wonderful friendship with Luciano Pavarotti for many, many years.
Oh, wow. We definitely know who he is, even in America.
Yeah. So I spent many a days with him. I don't know how many times I saw him singing live, probably at least 25, 30, if not more. I went to his apartment in New York for numerous parties, and even in Italy, I went to visit his house. He lived in Modena. And so I was fortunate enough to see him as not necessarily the artist, but the man behind the artist, and that I'll always treasure, because he was a very interesting person to get to know outside of the stage, outside of the opera world. So he was actually a very down-to-earth person. From Modena. Modena's a little town outside of Bologna. It's like Monroeville.
Right.
And and interesting enough, and most people don't know this, Luciano Pavarotti, probably one of the greatest tenors in the world ever, he went through over 20 auditions before somebody said, "Yeah, okay, we'll use you."
Let me ask you that, though, because I don't have the ear for opera, obviously, as someone who's been trained for it does. But I've heard, everybody's heard Luciano Pavarotti, and incredible.
Right.
And I've heard other opera stars. I've heard other opera singers, and they're like, wow, they're really good. How do you what makes him so good?
Well, first of all, his diction, when he sang, you understood every word he said, which is important, because that way you understand what you're saying, what the person is saying.
So it wasn't just a howling, like a well-tuned howling, right?
Well, his voice was a tenor voice, which was a higher tenor voice. So his voice almost squealed when he came out. Then he gave his artistry, his feeling for singing was unbelievable. I remember I saw him, at the Met with 5,000 people, and I saw him in Erie, Pennsylvania with 50 people. He always gave 110%. He always put out the best he could as a singer, and so all those things combined made him what he was. He was almost, at one point, as famous as the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, as far as notoriety. People used to go nuts. It was unbelievable. It was incredible. Because I witnessed this, firsthand. I was there. People they used to line up at the Met for maybe an hour afterwards to get autographs, And I remember one night we were there at the Met. They actually opened a room for him. They used to call it the Red Room. And I remember one night he was signing autographs. It was getting late. It was after midnight. And his manager came up and tapped him on the shoulder and says, "Luciano, we got to go." He turned and he said to him, "The next time you say that, you're not going to be my manager anymore, because these people are here for me, and if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here." So that's the type of person he was. He was very, he was very attached to his audience, and he sang because he loved to sing opera.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I don't say this trivially, but I do think a lot of artists sort of forget that. You're nobody as an artist without a crowd, you know?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
You know, it is the crowd that makes you. You don't make the crowd. You present something. If people like it, they accept it and they elevate you. And you have to remember that they are elevating you. And I think most people forget that.
And that goes even in sports, because you know, if a football team played in front of nobody, and then there would be no football team. You know, so in opera, in any type of art form is like that, opera, concerts, or whatever. So it's you know, again, I just think he was an unbelievable artist, and you know, just like my grandfather and my mother, and you know, my grandfather, just to tell you the type of artist that he was, and the type of artist that there were back in the day, and I'm not sure that art is still there today, because today, my mother told me years before she passed, she said, Samuele, she said to me, opera is not an art anymore, it's a business. And she was right. So, you know, when my grandfather, I remember, sang Don Giovanni at the Met, I don't know how many times, 30, 40, 50. One night, my mother came in, and he was sitting on a couch looking at the score of Don Giovanni late in his career. My mother said to him, says, Dad, why are you looking at that score? You sang that opera 50 times. And he looked at her and says, Dear, every time I look at the score, I learn something new.
Interesting.
Which tells you that's an artist, because he looks at, when he's singing the opera, when he's singing the Don Giovanni, he's really the Don Giovanni. He's not Ezio Pizza, or Luciano Pavarotti is not Luciano Pavarotti. He's Cavaradossi in Tosca, or he's Rodolfo in Bohème. He's really that person. And that's what it takes to be a great artist. And that also then comes out, and the audience appreciates that.
So what, you know, a lot of folks listening, opera is an acquired taste. I've learned to enjoy. In fact, I think, and I've heard Luciano Pavarotti in the 80s, and I remember him. And again, it was just something, you know, you can't put your finger on it. But you say, wow, there's just something different in about him. But I've learned to, you know, enjoy opera. In fact, I was very blessed last year to attend opera in Milan, at the famous opera house there in Milan. And and that's why I was like, I've sort of developed a new passion for it, you know. But there's a lot of and I'll be very honest, like there's a lot I don't know. You know, if you're telling somebody, says, you know, this is an art that you really want to appreciate. What do you tell people? Like you say, you know what, you go listen to this person, start here. Here's a good one. You know, something.
Well, I think a lot of times people make two mistakes. One, they go, how do you say? People go and see the wrong opera. First of all,
interesting. Yes.
And second of all, they're not prepared for that opera. They go there without knowing anything. If you get a little bit of the background, not only just the story, but a little bit how the opera came to be, the composer, and you go see an opera that's an easy opera to listen to the ears, you'll get a better enjoyment. And then from there, you can then build up. Don't go see a Wagnerian opera, because it's a 4-hour opera, and it's in German. It's a heavy opera. Maybe go see an Italian funny opera like Rossini, The Barber of Seville, which is jovial. The music is light, and people, and you know, that's the advice I give to people. Go look at something that's easy on the ears, and it's not.
I'll tell you what, it's well, as I say, if I don't want to interrupt, but it's funny you say that, because you know what, I realized I've been listening to opera since the 70s, and the irony was, I don't know if you remember, you used to watch the old Bugs Bunny cartoons.
Oh, yeah.
And they would do the Barber of Seville, and it would be Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny. But I remember as a kid, and I'll tell you what the funny thing about that was, because of that, I actually started listening to Wagner, because they had other things in some of the other skits, you know, not opera, but classical music. But I mean, it was just funny that turned me on to that. To your point, though, on the Barber of Seville, it was jovial, but then you liked the tune, so it definitely got you hooked.
And that's why they used it in the Bugs Bunny, because it was jovial, because it was something that people could relate to. In Italian, we call it orecchiabile, meaning it's a tune that you can hum later on.
Well, I tell you what I did. Figaro, Figaro, Figaro.
Right.
I can't sing it, but I know it.
But exactly. But like in today's music, you don't have that as much anymore. I have a friend of mine who composes music for movies. And I asked him, I said, how come that in the last 5, 6 to 8 years, all these movies that come out, nobody knows the score. I mean, think about when back in, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, all those tunes were just, people were like, oh yeah, that's from Raiders of the Lost Ark. You don't have that anymore. Things are changing. The arts is changing.
I tell you what, that is so funny that you say that, because I've said the same thing in the 70s and the 80s, and even before that. Actually, even before that. Right. Major movies like E.T., The Goonies, the Star Wars, they all had a song that you knew it.
Right. It's the same thing with TV shows. Brady Bunch, My Three Sons, Love American Style back in the 70s.
I think they got lazy and just started jamming music into it.
And now the music to me sounds all like it's all computerized.
Well, it is. It's auto tuned. It's auto pop. It's the same beat. Right. It's it's very formulaic.
Yeah, it's a bit different, unfortunately, and so it's just that's the way it is. So.
Well, Sam, listen, I can't believe this, but we've already been going for a little while now, and I definitely want to get you back on the show. I think this is fun, and we have a lot more to talk about.
I have other things to share with you. I do some programs out there in the community that people might be interested in going to see about Italy and where to go.
Well, that's what I want to ask you now. Before I kind of jump out here, I do want to let you know, how do folks get a hold of you, and how do they find you?
Well, they can either call me or they can email me. Should I give my number to you right now?
I'll tell you what, it's going to be down in the description. So you and I will share that offline, and I'll throw it in the description with your email. And I want folks to reach out to Sam. And Sam, I am going to have you back on much sooner rather than later, because I want to finish this conversation. But
great.
Awesome. Sam, listen, I want to thank you again for coming on. And like I said, I do mean this. When people take time out of their schedule to spend it with me, I appreciate it, brother.
Thank you.
So grazie mille. And then you know what? And listen, the next time we're going to do this solamente in italiano. Possiamo parlare solamente in italiano. Ho bisogno di praticare. Tu vuoi parlare italiano? Possiamo farlo. Cosa ne pensi?
Non c'è problema.
Perfetto. Grazie, Sam. Grazie mille.
Ciao.
All right, folks. I'm going to be right back after these messages. Thanks to Greater Pittsburgh Travel. For any of your travel needs, let Tom and the team at Greater Pittsburgh Travel know, and they'll take care of you. For more information, call 412-331-2244 or visit their website at www.greaterpittsburghtravel.com. For all of your plumbing needs, be sure to try Palucci Plumbing. Nick and the team have decades of experience and will get you back up and running. For more information, call Palucci Plumbing at 412-782-5050. And we want to thank the Calabria Club of Pittsburgh. If you're interested in learning more, you can find their contact information on Facebook at Calabria Club of Pittsburgh. Again, thanks Domenica and the team at the Calabria Club of Pittsburgh for your support. And we want to thank La Scuola d'Italia Galileo Galilei, the only nonprofit school in Pittsburgh endorsed by the Italian Consulate. If you're interested in learning Italian or have your children being immersed in the Italian culture and language, be sure to give them a call at 412-404-7070. And that's La Scuola d'Italia Galileo Galilei. We'd also like to thank Chris Gonzalez from the Knights of Columbus. If you have any questions about joining the Knights of Columbus, reach out to Chris Gonzalez at 412-605-9074. All right, welcome back. Again, appreciate my first guest. Sam is, I'm definitely going to have him back on the show because we have a lot more to talk about. And you kind of heard his background, opera, and, his knowing a lot about Luciano Pavarotti. So, if you know anything about opera, that is one of the most famous tenors ever. We're going to have to follow that little segment up, though, with, I'm not calling these guys the B team or anything. No, I'm kidding. Actually, they're great guys, and I'm very excited to have the whole team on here from the Lion's Den at 213 podcast. And again, I'm going to welcome Adam Pacheca, Nendo Lapuche, and Joe Griffo. Fellas, how you doing today?
Hey, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having us on.
Oh, no, actually, I'm glad to have you guys on because Adam and I are on a super secret chat text, and we were talking about some things, and I said, you know what, we need to cross-pollinate our shows because I think there's a lot of good shows out there, and, I'm all about sharing the love. So if I can promote other folks' work, I am all for that. And so I do appreciate the fact you guys are taking time out of your schedule to join me and having your own podcast. What a joy it is to schedule guests and to coordinate it and all that good fun. And you're like, damn it, this better be a good show. So fellas, You better wow me because you've got your own show. So, Adam, I'm starting with you. Wow me, fella.
Well, first of all, Steve, I just have to say how big of a fan I am of the Italian Impact Weekly podcast and all the work that you do. And also the great people at Pittsburgh out there. I got to meet some people at IAFL from Pittsburgh, and you guys have such a strong Italian-American community out there. Really, it could be the envy of the major Italian-American communities here in New York. So I don't know, we have a little competition going. But no, seriously, though, no, thank you so much for having us on. We really appreciate it. And, podcasting, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of, schedules. You have to coordinate certain things, but it bears good fruit. And we are the official podcast of the Antonio Meucci Lodge 213, located in White Plains, New York, just probably about 20 or so miles outside of New York City in Westchester County. We are the second largest lodge in New York State for the Order Sons and Daughters of Italy in America, which is the oldest Italian-American organization in the country, for those of you who don't know. And the podcast kind of came out of the idea of contributions to the lodge. So our president, Mario Tremelli, shout out to him, he calls people all the time to bring your skills, bring your passions, bring whatever you can, and bring a piece of it to the lodge. And full disclosure, I have another podcast that I do real quick. I'm going to give a plug for. It's called The Place to Be, and it's all about Seinfeld. If you're a Seinfeld fan, I don't know if any of your listeners out there.
I believe I've heard of him, and we kind of like him.
All right, good. Yes. So, no, seriously. So, if
by the way, Adam, real quick, I was totally kidding you. You didn't have to wow me, but I want you to know you did wow me. No, that's pretty awesome. It's funny you say SOI because I am actually a member of our lodge out here, Nicola Massi, and I actually like that organization a lot. So I do encourage folks, if you are not familiar with the Sons and Daughters of Italy, you check it out because there's probably a lodge near you, especially if you're listening to this show.
Yes, highly recommend getting involved. It's a great organization. And so I had done the Seinfeld podcast, and then I toyed with the idea of bringing up a podcast. I'm like, I don't know, a lot of people don't necessarily know about podcasting, this and that, but then I ended up speaking with Brother Joe and Brother Nando. They both thought it was a great idea, so we presented it to President Mario, and here we are, almost, over a year later.
Well, that's
We've
awesome.
Had some great guests, talked about some great topics, and really brought awareness to the lodge.
No, that's awesome. And you know what I like too? Like the fact that you guys you're focused on something specific, which is good, because what I'm noticing, and by the way, I'm going to jump into Nando and Joe and give them a few seconds, but there's a lot of people that, quote, want to do a podcast, but it's like, and then you ask them, so what do you want to do it on? And it's like, I just want to do a podcast. And I think, if I were king for a day and someone asked me for advice on what to do, I would say, have a purpose for your podcast, and you guys have a purpose, and the purpose was ultimately initially to support the lodge. Now it might morph a little bit, it might grow, and it might expand. That's a good thing because that means that the podcast is getting more mature. But I do like the fact that you guys had an initial purpose of what you were doing, which then made identifying guests, focusing on what you want to talk about, coordinating it, advertising events that were going on. Boy, doesn't that make it easier versus I want to do a podcast, Nando, Joe, how you guys doing?
We're doing okay. Thank you so much for having us on.
And again, appreciate you guys taking time out. And now you guys have been with the lodge, I take it, for a long time.
This is Brother Nando from podcast 213, from the Lions Den at 213. We've been. I've been a member for a while now. I am on the board of directors at the lodge, and it's really, to quote our president Mario, it is truly a labor of love. And just like being a member at the lodge, yes, podcasting is in fact a labor of love. And like you said, we certainly like to focus on a specific topic, which is bringing awareness of the lodge and some of the cultural issues that we face as Italian Americans, and talk about the Italian American experience. But more importantly, we want to be able to bridge the gap between some of our senior members and some of our newer members, because again, some of the traditions, they're being forgotten as the members pass away and so forth, and we want to try to find a way to kind of almost preserve some of that folklore and some of that culture.
And Nando, you know what? You said something super important to me, and I'm not doing this as a shameless plug, but I filmed a documentary last year, and okay, Steve, we're tired of hearing about it, but it's called A Fidelta Soldier Prisoner. It's on Amazon Prime. No, I'm kidding. But I tell you, one thing I learned from that whole experience was people want to be heard, but nobody's asking them. And then when people think that, hey, I want to know, like let's say an older member, and you say, God, I want to ask him a question. Well, he's passed on. You can never ask that person that question again. So while they're still here, I am like huge proponent of interview them. Even if you think what they're saying isn't important now, there might be a time you're gonna be like, man, I'm glad we took the time out to listen to that person, because they wanted to be heard. They wanted to leave kind of a legacy. So I think that you kind of nailed something that's near and dear to my heart, which is capturing the stories of folks. I hate to say it like this, especially they're older and they don't have much time left. We're all going to get there one day, God willing. Later, not sooner. But everybody's got something. And if you just take a few minutes out to talk to them and say, I had so and so, on the podcast, and he talked about the lodge from 30 years ago. People don't know what that means to that person. They're reliving memories. They're reliving the joys of when it was young, when they were young, and their friends. The good time they had. And you talked about the labor of love, but in a lot of people, especially folks that have been doing it a long time, what you find out is it's not only just a labor of love; it becomes a purpose in their life. And I don't think people,
it does. Indeed, it does.
And people don't appreciate that. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's exactly that. And one of the things that we've been very successful at is being able to get some of not only just our members, which I think are obviously the backbone of our lodge, but it's exactly that. It's telling us the story, telling us your experience, and being able to find a way to link their experiences with our present time. So, and even Brother Joe is great at getting some of these people on and being able to get that experience on record.
And Joe, let's talk about your turn now. Let's talk about the podcast and talk about your experience as an SOI and what does this mean to you?
Similar to Brother Adam and Brother Nando, we started out labor of love doing this podcast, and it has grown tremendously. We're all on the board as well. And, we use this, like Nando had mentioned, right, to try to push certain customs and traditions, but also we're trying to use this as almost a way to build momentum, right? We talk about what we're doing within our lodge and bring excitement within our lodge to say, hey, guys, look at all the good things that's happening. Come be part of it. The more feedback we get, the more input we get, helps us grow, right? And we try to use that to build this momentum so we could move forward and bring more exciting events into our lodge. Now,
do you feel that the podcast has helped with recruiting?
I believe so. We get a lot of great feedback when Brother Adam makes the announcement at our meetings that a new podcast was uploaded. Everybody's very happy. They come to us. They, give us all, good news, right? And they bring some suggestions. How about you do this? How about you do that? But given the feedback and the buzz within our lodge, at the Antonio Meucci Lodge, I definitely feel it does.
Now, I would agree with you, Brother Joe. I think it's exactly that. You have people that kind of hear the show and they're like, oh, I didn't know that you guys were as involved as you were. I didn't know that you guys were part of such and such event. And it really just brings a little bit of excitement and helps draw people to our organization.
And I was going to ask you, do you guys record at events?
So that's not something we do right now. So we do the pre-recording right now, but we talk about the different events. And right now we're on a schedule of, we always release an episode right before our monthly meeting. So we'll always talk about upcoming events and, make the call out to people to say, sign up and get involved, whatnot. Like, for example, right now we're planning our Italian Heritage Festival in July. And if any of your listeners or anybody out there wants to come visit us, that's the best way you can find out about who we are. That's our main event. But, just going back real quick as well to recruiting, you'd asked Brother Joe about that, but it's also helped to bring a younger audience to realize what the Order Sons and Daughters of Italy is all about. Because, personally, I kind of stumbled across it, quite by accident, trying to get more into my Italian heritage. And I think it's a great way to explain what the Order is all about and what our lodge does. Yeah, so it's helped. It's been a big help. It's been a big boon, and it kind of sets us apart from a lot of other lodges and what they're doing.
Now, let me ask you guys a question, because that's a very interesting point you brought there. I, too, kind of went, and I've noticed a lot of people, they go on this journey later on in life. And then, when you realize when you finally realize you're connected to your roots, you feel like a, I don't want to call it a completeness, but it definitely makes you feel a little better, a little more proud, because you understand, the struggles, the trials, the tribulations. These people came over here. You just understand your culture, where you came from. I do believe as humans that is important. I think you really have to understand where you've come from, all facets. I am not 100% Italian. And I know, Nando, you're not 100% Italian either. But, that's a big part of who we are, and we have other roots, though. But I think as humans, to know where we've come from gives us a sense of security. That's why one of the big dangers you see out there are these people that are trying to kind of erase history. Well, if they can erase history, they can tell you who you are. They can change you. They can make you into something you don't necessarily even think you want to be. So it's so important. Now, let's take that to the Lodge. How does the Lodge help you connect to your culture, or in this case, your Italian culture?
Well, in my case, but just to go back to what you were saying, the generations are so different. We have especially, the World War II generation, the survivors, the refugees, the veterans. You always hear the stories about, they never talked about it, and it's so true. They never talked about their experience. I don't know whether it was to protect the younger generation, to protect their kids, or to try to assimilate into the American culture, let's say. But it's so true. My grandparents never really spoke about their particular struggles, as Italian Americans, and what their struggles were when they emigrated to the States. But when you start to kind of dig in a little bit and you talk to them, and it's exactly right. You cannot erase the history. And I'll plug President Mario and his, unwavering support to maintain and preserve the history of Christopher Columbus and so forth. And you're right. We deserve a seat at the table. Our name, we helped build this country. Our ancestors helped build this country, and that means something. And this is one of the goals of our particular show, is to, like we said, bridge that gap. You hear sometimes you just don't hear those stories. And we kind of, exactly like you said, we dig in a little bit and we just have a casual conversation with these folks, and you'd be surprised the amount of knowledge that these people have, whether it be, blue collar type of work, or literature, or the arts, or just, everyday life. And their experiences, their stories are so amazing. And you can't help but be dialed in when you hear these people talk.
Well, it's funny you say Columbus, and I'm going to let you have this, but that is a perfect example of a historical figure that is being misrepresented. He's no saint, I get it, but he is not what they have now, again, decided to say he was. Again, if you read a history book from 50, 60 years ago, boy, it's quite different than what they're, quote, saying now. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on that. We live in a world of presentism, and I don't like to get political on shows like this, but we live in a world of presentism where it's like you judge the world of 500 years ago based on today's standards. You're right. He was no saint, but nobody else was really a saint. If the people had slaves and servants, if you could afford one, hey, you had one. Thank goodness we have evolved as a society and a culture to know that, hey, this is wrong. But, we can't go back and change history. The scars are what they are. The marks are what they are. We can't change history, but we can do something today to shape the next 50, the next 100 years. We can do that today. And the only way we can do that today is by knowing what we did before and learn from the mistakes of the past and try to be better from it.
No, that's absolutely right. And I'll tell you, the irony, though, what you said is, I'm not so sure we have better morals and standards. I think we want to pretend like we do. And the people that are screaming the loudest, in my opinion, are the most hypocritical, especially the ones tearing down his statue. Because if you look at, and again, to your point, I won't get political, but let's just say that considering the evilness that occurs in today's generation that is accepted, to sit there and turn around and judge those people from 500 years ago, it's very hypocritical. So I'm all for leave them statues alone. He's no saint, but he is a significant enough historical figure that you don't tear those statues down just because you don't feel like his morals from 500 years ago match what you think your morals are today, which, again, I'll be one to make a wager that they're not so good. But again, that's my 2 cents. But let's talk about some other things. So, you touched on, being able to learn from these older, members of the lodge. Well, I'll tell you one funny thing from the documentary, and I'll let you guys take it. Again, I know people probably might be sick of hearing me talk about the documentary, but I'm sorry, it's a good documentary. But there's a great line in it, and she's one of the daughters of a prisoner, and she says, I didn't talk to my father about his wartime experience. And she's reflecting, and she says, but I don't know if it's because he didn't want to talk about it or I just never thought to ask him. And I think that's a huge point right there, that are we asking the older generation, tell me about life 60, 70, 80 years ago, or tell me what your parents or grandparents taught you and their experiences that you remember. And I'm not so sure we ask anymore.
Well, I think a lot of times and I want to have Brother Joe and Brother Adam piggyback on this, but sometimes it's not so much about asking. I think it's just more about talking about it. And, yes, is there a general question that you can pose in there? Sure. But I think sometimes if you just have a chat with people, people will tell you a lot about themselves if you let them.
Agree.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to piggyback off of that as well, I will say, kind of tying it all into how we preserve culture at the lodge and like the stories that people tell. I'm not from New York originally. I'm from actually the state with the second highest per capita population of Italians, Rhode Island. But coming from there and then coming to this, New York Italian culture, which has its own specificity, because Italian American cultures differ, whether it's, New York or Pittsburgh or Cleveland or New Orleans, wherever. And yeah, people, you just have to be willing to sit down and listen. And I think we're Italians. We love to talk, obviously, but you have to be willing to also sit down and listen. And yeah, like Brother Nando said, people will be willing to tell you their stories. Yeah, sometimes the questions aren't asked, or there are certain things that, whether it's a generational difference or whether people just don't simply want to talk about it because it brings back too many bad memories, they don't want to talk about it, even if they are asked about it. But I think the important thing is to listen to these stories. And yeah, kind of like what you were saying, Steve, where, the stories might seem like they're insignificant. They're like, why is he telling me about this? But then you really dig deep and you learn about the history of where you are or where you come from and how important it is. It's just really amazing what you can find out.
Yeah, and you get different views, right? I mean, people have different experiences during different times, who was part of the migration, who was involved, and just getting the fiction of what they've seen is eye-opening.
Right. And I think a lot of things that are lost is, and you kind of sort of touched on, is when they arrived here also made a difference from the generational differences of the Italians. So were they pre-World War II or post-World War II? Were they from the North? Were they from the Central? Or were from the South? And then where did they settle at in the United States? And all of that combined absolutely creates different types of Italian-American communities, because people look at, the standard, the Brooklyn, New York Italian and say, oh, that's the way Italians are, or they're the way they are in Jersey, but they're different than they are in Cleveland. There's a lot of Italians in Columbus, Pittsburgh, Rhode Island's another. I think Connecticut is another. A lot of Italians in Connecticut.
Connecticut's actually the number one population.
There you go. So I mean, and they're all over. And then don't forget there were a bunch of Italians that moved to the South after the Civil War in the late 1800s because they worked the field. So they came from poor, impoverished parts of Italy to go work the fields in the South after the Civil War was over, when they needed cheap labor. So they brought in a lot of Italian immigrants, or they worked in the coal mines in West Virginia. So, and that had an influence and an impact on how those communities changed. And I don't think that people, I don't think there's a clear enough understanding in the U.S. of what it means to be an Italian American, because we've been so stereotyped from the movies to act like we're all a bunch of guineas from Brooklyn, that kind of ridiculousness. Now, it's not saying that there aren't people that have that, I don't say that sort of patronage or genre, whatever term you want to call it, but that's not reflective of all the Italian Americans. How do you guys promote what being an Italian American means, generally speaking, and then maybe more specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, at least for my portion of the show, I like to talk a little bit I like to talk a lot of it about the arts and the literature, and particularly when we speak about the arts, the first thing we think about is Florence and Tuscany, and we are relegated to the names of Michelangelo and Da Vinci, but we forget that there are these amazing writers and authors and playwrights and composers, Pirandello, Italo Calvino, and all these names that may not necessarily be mainstream, but they, play such an important part in American culture. And to kind of link that, it's interesting when you speak to some of our senior members how connected they are to writers like that, because that's what they learned in school as well. And then, now you have a basis for a conversation, and it's amazing where those conversations go. But when you're limited to Leonardo and Raphael, and you forget about Gabriele D'Annunzio, and you forget about Torquato Tasso, and all of these amazing figures of literature and the arts in Italy, it's really eye-opening when you start to learn about them.
Yeah, and if I may jump in as well, one of the thesis statements basically for our show, and I think I said it at the beginning in our first episode, is that, as you were saying, Steve, and as we always talk about, the Italian immigrants that came here, they struggled, they fought to come here, to build a better life for their families and to, try to have something better than they had in Italy. And the question is, what are we doing to preserve that? What are we doing to make sure that their heritage and legacy isn't lost? And one thing that's really interesting that's eye-opening and fantastic to see is so many people who are young adults in their 20s and 30s who are Italian Americans who are so passionate about preserving the heritage and the culture and what they are building. And, obviously, yes, we look to history, we look to our stories of the past and to the arts and the literature and the food, obviously, things like that. But we also look to what people are doing now to sort of write the Italian American story, because it's still being written. It's, we're still writing it. We're still innovating. We're still proving ourselves for who we are. And that's one thing that we talk about, with IAFL, Italian American Future Leaders, for those who don't know about it, is an organization of young adult Italian Americans from all over the country who come together, talk about different topics. And that's one of the big topics that we spoke about was Italian American representation in the media, because what do people always think of? They think about the mafia, they think about food. That's about as far as it goes. And yeah, like Brother Nando said, we have so much more to it with the literature and the arts and education and inventions. The name of our lodge, Antonio Meucci, the inventor of the telephone. It's so. But again, there's the history there's a lot of history that's already been written, but we're still writing it and still working on it and still innovating.
Yeah, and I just want to make a correction. I think I said Giovanni Pirandello. It's actually Luigi Pirandello, and the Giovanni is Boccaccio. So I just want to make sure I correct that.
I'm glad you fixed that, because I was I was frantically writing. I'm not going to lie, I had no idea, but I'm just going to nod and say, you got it, buddy.
but yeah, no, and it's true. And again, the contributions that Italian Americans have made. I mean, guys like Enrico Fermi, who worked on the Manhattan Project. Right. I mean, without his idea and concept of nuclear fusion, we would never have gotten to where we got as far as America is right now. So I think it's important that we continue to try to make sure that these figures don't fade away from our teachings and education. And I think that's something that we are working towards here on our podcast, is to find a way to try to keep that alive.
Well, it sounds like you guys are doing an excellent job. And I'll tell you what else. I think you also nailed something that's near and dear. It's about honoring the past. Those people took a heck of a gamble to get on a boat. And immigration today is very different. I know. I worked for the government. I know how immigration works in this country. I mean, I worked for DHS for a while. So I know, and I've worked with LE guys. So I know the differences between the way people move today and they moved 120, 140 years ago. And let me just say that it was a heck of a lot more of a gamble, I think, back then, when you didn't have instant communications. You didn't have groups out there helping you, what to say, how to do this. You grabbed your suitcase, you saved your money for your ticket, whatever money was in your pocket, you got on the boat, you made the trek, you showed up at Ellis Island. And here's another thing that people do not acknowledge or remember. Not everyone that showed up was allowed in. A lot of people were sent home. So it's always been, for lack of better terms, U.S. policy to vet the people coming into the country. So again, a little political, but important, because the ones that made it, they didn't know they were going to make it. There was no guarantees. And then when they got here, where were they going? Maybe they typically had to have somebody to sponsor you, so they're going to show up at the city. They probably don't speak any English. They're probably not educated for the most part. And, they're rolling the die. And some of them may have been leaving a wife and kids behind. And they're just saying, I'll get you later. So I don't think people appreciate this. And it's not just the Italians, by the way. That's a lot of the immigrants back then. I don't think people appreciate the sacrifice. Because when I went back to Italy and I met relatives, and they told me, they were like, yeah, we remember our great uncle going there, and we remember our grandmother telling us that her brother went to America, and they never heard from him again. He died not too many years after he came to America. So, people just don't appreciate that sacrifice and the risk they took. Now, it worked out on a lot of occasions, but it didn't always work out. Can you imagine making the trip and being told, no, you got to go home? Or making the trip and then, something happens and you don't make it. Or like I said, you die fairly young, or you never, it just doesn't work and maybe you have to go back. So it wasn't like if I went to America, I was guaranteed I'm going to make it. It was a lot of hard work and there were no guarantees. Only thing they knew was they would work hard. That's all they knew. And then whatever happened to them. So, the fact that you honor their memories, I think that's important. Your thoughts?
100% agree. I mean, I hear the stories that I hear from my family when they migrated, and to be in those shoes, it's scary. Like you said, now you have phones, you have means of communications, but like I hear my father, for example, he was a furniture maker, and my uncle had sponsored him, and he came to New York with pretty much nothing, just a suitcase with a couple hand tools, not knowing the language, not knowing where you're going, who you're going to see. It's just, it's scary, and to say somebody asks you, hey, would you drop everything, leave your family, your friends, everything you have behind to go to the other side of the world, not knowing the language and trying to make a life out of it? It's scary. It really is.
It reminds me a little bit, and I'm going to just deviate a little bit. I watched a TED Talk, and I'll be very brief about it. I think it was a TED Talk with Richard Dreyfuss, and he's talking about what makes the United States a miracle. And it's just, the long and short of it was like, if you can get here, and if you can make it, you have a chance. There's no guarantees, but you can rise on your own merit. And I think that there's no better example of that than with the Italian-American experience and the Italian immigration in the United States. You have seen people of Italian people just really, really make it. And listen, when we say make it, just be able to earn a simple living and live freely without really any consequence. Fail, and then try something different. And that, I think, is the amazing part, not only of the United States, but and what makes this country so amazing, but what the chance that you get as an immigrant to do those things and to rise by merit. I think it's a tremendous, it's an amazing thing to see and to hear about.
Yeah, and funny you say that, because I do feel like there's some great stories that unfortunately have been lost to time. And, for like success stories. And I don't mean success meaning they were millionaires. I mean people that came and may have done something that might have seemed small, but it's the ripple effects of achievement that people don't appreciate. It's the little things that add up. So they came over and they did something, and as a result, their kid was able to do this, and then their kid was able to do this. And I don't think people, appreciate that. It doesn't all have to happen overnight. And I would also say the idea to come here and take that shot, you kind of nailed it. It didn't take them long to figure out hard work was going to get me where I'm getting, because I wasn't going to get any preferential treatment. I wasn't going to get treated well. If I came here and I wanted to make it, I needed to do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, I wasn't going to make it. And I just think that is important, that can still happen in America. And that is what makes us special as a country. So these people weren't in any rush to leave their country. They had to leave their country. There was no opportunities. And they came here and they took a shot. Fellas, I appreciate you taking time out. You know what? We're already well past what I was going to budget for us, because you guys have some good points and you're doing some good work out there, and I appreciate it. If folks want to tune into your show, where can they find you?
So they can find us wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We're not on YouTube yet, so we're still a little bit in our infancy, still working out some technological stuff, but we're definitely building more. And you can also go to our website. It's AntonioMeucciLodge.com. I believe, right, Brother Joe? It's AntonioMeucciLodge.com?
Correct.
Yeah, so if you go to AntonioMeucciLodge.com, our website, you can find a link right to the podcast, and it'll bring you to our latest episode. People can do it that way. So, and please, we're going to have some great people coming on pretty soon, and great things coming up. So, and
I'll put that link down in the description so you guys can check it out. And I want to thank Adam, Nando, and Joe. Hey, fellas, thanks again for coming on the show today. I think we had a fun little discussion, and again, we keep reinforcing the fact that don't forget your heritage. Learn about your heritage. Talk to folks that have been around. Learn from them, because there's going to be a time when they're not around, and you're not going to be able to ask them the questions. So whether you think you care now or not, there will be a time when you do, and you're going to miss it. So don't miss it. Fellas, one more time, thank you very much for coming on the show, and I look forward to having you back sometime. I think we're going to have more to talk about. So with that being said, I want to thank our listeners, as always, from all over the world. I've got them coming in from China, Russia, Australia, yes, Russia, yes, China, Australia, the UK, a bunch of parts in Africa, Brazil, the US, Canada. They're just listening from all over the world, and I can't thank you enough for, taking time out to download me, to listen to little old me here coming out of Pittsburgh. So thank you very much, and in the meantime, you have a wonderful and a blessed week.